Hello everyone. I think we're live. Yes, we are. How are you doing, guys? Welcome back to another RP Talks, not AP Talks. I don't know what AP is. Uh, Maraki isn't here today, so we have I guess a guest co-host being Jake.
Hello, I'm Jake.
He's who I bother whenever I need someone.
I've been bothered.
And we have Oak, who will be standing in for the topic Forsaken RP and Law.
That's me. Hello.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little, Oak? What you roleplay and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. So I roleplay a character called Corvinus Winteroak. He's leader of a group called the Tyrus Fallen. Kind of just a group of your kind of friendly neighborhood undead. And I also do some stuff with like priest roleplay with the Conclave. And I also organize the night markets that take place in the Sepulchre once a month.
All right. Let's have a look. Let's before we dive into law, I guess we'll talk about Forsaken roleplay and how that's handled.
Mm-hmm.
Then, since neither me or Markus roleplay Forsaken, that's probably best your area. So, what is Forsaken roleplay like for you, and for others maybe?
I think for me, like role-playing the Forsaken wasn't something I was ever really interested in before. I've kind of had like 13 years on Alliance roleplay. And then I was really intrigued by the Forsaken with the book Before the Storm. So it took a while to kind of get into, because even though, you're a human of sorts, like you're an undead human, there are a lot of kind of nuances and facets that kind of go into playing somebody of that state and those experiences, and the physiology you've got to be mindful of and things like that. So it's it's a lot to take on board, and there's a lot to kind of be mindful of going forward if you're developing a character, I think.
All right. What are the kind of like directions you can take with it?
I think there are as many as there are kind of any other races. I think one thing that I always find really interesting about the Forsaken is there is that kind of duality of who you were and what you did in life, as opposed to who you are and what you do in Undeath. And the kind of the interplay between them can be that, you died a kitchen servant and you woke up and you're still pretty much a servant, or, you died a servant and you woke up and you pick up a blade and you go off and become like a warrior. So I think there's kind of that to be mindful of, like your in-character kind of profession and what you did. And then there's obviously, are you more of a ghoul? Are you kind of more of a mindless kind? How far rotted are you along? Like, are you literally falling apart at the seams? Are all your parts your own? Or are you like an amalgamation of kind of different bits over time? If you kind of fixed yourself up as you've gone along? So there's loads to go with. And of course, at the moment, there's that split between kind of loyalist undead who are kind of still beholden to like Sylvanas and her vision, and those who have kind of shrugged that off and are trying to make the best, with many of them being refugees in Orgrimmar at the moment and dealing with that at the moment.
All right. How many of you actually come across with the idea that they have amnesia? They don't remember their past life.
Quite like the whole like amnesia thing is quite common. I think sometimes it's kind of an easy pass if you're kind of not 100% sure on the character at the moment. You can kind of, I don't really remember at the moment, I'll flesh it out later. But I think a lot of people actually come to the table with like a really fully formed first life character, and how that plays into, I suppose, a second life character as an undead.
On that note, I'm really curious as to how you deal with like the psychological shift from living to dying. I know with the Night Elves who were raised to Dark Wardens. Was it Dark Warden?
Dark Rangers, a lot of them, and some Dark Wardens.
Dark Rangers and Dark Wardens, yeah.
They were very, like, it's like they had the hate and discontent magnified. How do people handle that with Forsaken RP with just, say, so a Lordaeonian human, for example?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think a lot of... There isn't like a really clear-cut thing with this. I kind of guess that a lot of your resurrection depends on the circumstances of your death. It depends a lot on kind of your character before, how they were in life. So, like, yeah, you see the Dark Rangers who were Kaldorei in life, and, the Wardens who were killed and were resurrected. they're quite kind of hate-filled, and for them there's a big sense of betrayal, that they were kind of abandoned by a loon, that Whisperwind and Stormrage weren't really there to kind of help them. And so there's a lot of anger at the world for like their perceived injustice. Whereas, you know, you look at, say, God, I always get my Proudmoors mixed up. There are far too many. I want to say Derek. No, the one who was risen. Whoever was risen by Sylvanas, I always forget him.
Derek Proudmoore, isn't it?
Derek. Oh, was that him?
I think
I
his name
think
is
it's
Derek.
Derek.
Yeah,
I think it was Derek. I'm going to go
There
with it.
certainly
Why
is a
does that feel
Derek.
wrong? I'm pretty sure it is Derek.
There is a Derek. He's
Yeah.
out there. It's one of them, not the lost Proudmoore brother. When he was resurrected, he wasn't hateful. He was more of a blank slate, and Sylvanas was trying to manipulate that to make him into a weapon against his family. So I think... Go on.
Sorry, do you think that the way they die plays into the kind of way they rise as well? Or how
Yeah.
long they've been dead? Because with Derek, he's had a completely different situation the way he died
Yeah.
in comparison to the Dark Rangers and Dark Wardens.
Yeah, I mean, they both died in kind of war and fighting situations. You know, he was obviously killed at sea and all of that. So they both died as a result of war. But I think for the Risen Calderai, it's a very fresh memory of war.
Yeah.
And when Derek first woke up, his first things were like, oh, I was on my ship, we were attacked, there was dragonfire. Like, he could immediately recall the events that preceded his death. But there were more questions for him. He was like, you know, what's going on? What's happened? Like, who am I? And of course, you know, then immediate imprisonment and torture. Whereas for the Dark Rangers, you know, for them as Calderai, who are very about nature and a loon, to come back as undead is like an ultimate betrayal of who they were in life.
Yeah.
And I think that creates a lot of conflict at the hearts of their souls and their characters. And that's why many of them are so rage-driven at the moment.
All right. A lot of the times, Forsakens are raised with like a damaged story, right? It's not entirely like there. Basically, does that play any role in the way that you roleplay?
You mean like with like their personalities or like their bodies, or both?
Personality, both, pretty much.
It depends. I think one of the things you see a lot of at the moment, ever since the kind of Nathanos got the remodel, is that there are a lot of Forsaken role players who are like the freshest corpses around. Like, their skin is like slightly ashen, but otherwise they kind of portray themselves as being, you know, fully intact. I guess that's what's in vogue at the moment for many Forsaken role players. But you still find some who are like falling apart at the seams, or, you know, are literally skin and bones.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends a lot on, you know, your personal aesthetic and your personal taste. I guess for some people, role playing, you know, bits of you falling off is a bit garish and a bit ghoulish, and maybe it's something they're comfortable with, and some really lean into it. As for personalities, it depends a lot again. Most of the characters that I come across are a lot more kind of moderate Forsaken, and we're seemingly quite moderate people in life. But of course, you have a lot of role players who also are kind of the darker shade of how the Forsaken can go. And so it's kind of like a weird kind of spectrum between kind of very kind of, you know, shady, morally questionable characters, and then a lot of folks who are just kind of like trying to make the best out of a bad situation.
Yeah.
Going back on their resurrection, do you think it is the circumstance of their resurrection mostly that decides on which side of the fence they'd be there?
I think the act of coming back can be very traumatic. You know, you die, and then your soul is kind of ripped off from like a peaceful future and shoved back in to a body that's, you know, dead and decaying. And so I think the actual magical process is something that can be very traumatic for people, and that can, I think, you know, you look at all these kind of undead Lordaronians, many of them were civilians, and, you know, they weren't all paladins and footmen, you know, they were just the general populace. So most of them would have been like your average run-of-the-mill person, and then they've come back and many become kind of darker, shaded, jaded people. So I think the act of resurrection can do that to you, but I also think the circumstances that you're resurrected into plays more of a role in shaping who you are. Like, you look at the Kaldorei, they're resurrected and turned into weapons against their own people, and that hate is stoked by Sylvanas. She very much encourages them down that path, because that's her path, that's her experience of being undead. But then you look at, Tandrid, and he was being pushed down that path by Sylvanas, but then was rescued and was taken back to his family and put into contact with Kalia. And so you see that it's, I think, more nurture versus nature at that point, I think.
Yeah. What's the perception of undeath for many of them? Does it vary, or do you think they have the same mindset, or is it the same thing where it kind of depends on the factor of the time, place, and how,
I think it does depend a lot on those circumstances. I mean, I've met characters who had been sort of dead for decades before the Third War. Like, they were in their tombs or their graves, and they were resurrected en masse kind of by the Scourge. And so for them, they tend to kind of roleplay as being a bit more kind of confused about things because they've been gone for so long.
Yeah.
And you get some who don't really kind of survive that process, like as people or as personalities, because they've physically degraded to such a point that there isn't much of a person left, and whatever semblance of a soul is yanked back and shoved inside of it, there's not kind of much left to go on. So I think time is also a factor. I think if you're quite freshly risen, there's a lot more of your muchness that kind of hangs around.
There's a point here that I think we should focus on, that being free will, and just how any undead goes about obtaining it. Because with the I want to mention the Dark Wardens again. Those specifically, I am a little unconvinced that rage alone would be enough for them to
how much of their mind was
betray their own kin. When kin slaying amongst night elves is terrible. Like, it's bad for everyone else, but these are very ancient people that are very I wouldn't say. Actually, I don't quite know how to put it there, but
they're more tightly knit together. They're
more homogenous.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the Dark Wardens, the risen night elves, had free will, and that their anger alone was enough to betray their own kind, or do you think that Sylvanas, those that raised them, were, if not directly controlling them, pointing them in a direction?
Yeah, it's like, so you definitely do see the free will, and I think for a long time Sylvanas was very on it with the free will part. You would see it in the Forsaken starting area, like people would be risen and they're given a choice, like, do you want to kind of go on as this? And some choose to return to the grave, and some choose to kind of run off, like Lillian Voss did at first. So I think inherently there's an element of free will and choice. But then if you're given two options and both options are already decided for you, and you're in a very contrived, manipulated circumstance, then, for all the free will in the world, you're still limited by the choices given to you. And I think Sylvanas is a very good strategist and a very good manipulator and a very good provocateur. Yeah, it's the illusion of choice. They are choosing to kind of side up, but then do they really have a choice to do that anyway? Like, I'm sure they could have, if they had wanted to, have turned away and, said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go for some moonberry juice. But the circumstances that they're in, their home on fire, the fact that Whisper and Malfurion kind of aren't around, that Elune has seemingly abandoned them, give Sylvanas ammunition to distort and manipulate.
Because I think we see it in the Forsaken Starting Zone, it's ever like present. You either join or you die. Obviously, the third option with Lillian was run off, but
yeah,
she eventually joined the Forsaken anyway.
There were some others who run off, and they were diminutively called the Rot Brains by the Forsaken.
Yeah.
So you can be risen and walk away from it, but not return to the grave. I would say that's a very rare choice, because the Forsaken offers security, and you've just been risen as something that you've seen as a monster, and many people will see as a monster and a threat. And Sylvanas and her Forsaken offered security and family and safety. And for some people, that's enough to kind of not return to the grave and to try and make a life of it.
Welly Ellie Boots mentions that resurrection is that you are in control of a master, regardless of how you are resurrected. And I'm not sure of the truthfulness behind that. If there is an actual intrinsic link between the, for all intents and purposes, necromancer, the person who raises you.
Yeah, I think
it would also depend on the sentience of the corpse as well.
It's a really interesting point, because obviously most of the undead that we know are raised by the Lich King and are therefore, default slaves to the Frozen Throne and the Helm of Domination. And, you could argue Kali was resurrected by a Naru. Does that mean that she's in some way beholden to them? Are they the puppeteer behind that undead?
As far as I know, there's nothing to say that if you are resurrected or reanimated by something, you are under some kind of control, regardless to it.
I
don't think the control in the sense would be magic, though. As we mentioned, it's more of like you're being presented with no other option than the one that's obviously hanging in front of you. Either you live or die.
Although I think low-level Scourge, and therefore kind of lower-level undead like ghouls, for example, if they're resurrected by a Death Knight, I would imagine they are enslaved by the Death Knight. I don't think they would have the option to kind of pack up bags and, tour Azeroth. So I think it depends on your level of wholeness when you're brought back and your circumstances.
Could the reanimator not just choose to raise a completely independent sentient undead?
Yeah, and the ability to do that is very limited.
Yeah, it depends on the power of the person behind it as well.
But
you can raise a skeleton and animate it, but only really the Lich King, the Valkyr, groups of Death Knights have proven to be able to raise a sentient corpse and a free-willed, free-thinking one back into a body. So I think it's a very limited power that's out there.
I think that makes good sense.
Well, since we're speaking on resurrection, let's speak on death. Punishment for the Forsaken, I read up a bit, is true death, which is the final death, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's an interesting part of the culture, and it's really touched upon in Before the Storm. One of the Desolate Council kind of leads a memorial, and she talks about people going into like their last death and their final death and how significant that is for the Forsaken. And then true death being kind of used as you've strayed, you've wandered off from our way of things, and your punishment will be a true death in that you're not coming back from this one.
Yeah. And then you got the last death, which is where the Forsaken themselves just accept that their time is done.
Yeah.
Which is pretty simple and basic, but I didn't really know those were like the actual terms for it. I thought it was just executed, pretty much.
Yeah,
executed and just wasted away.
I was just as a to notify you guys that I do a bit of research before this. I have a bunch of bullet points before me at the moment.
I will say that last death is, for many Forsaken, as we're kind of led to understand through the books, is something that a lot of them are very kind of uneasy and wary about, because their physical forms are quite fragile.
Yeah.
And so many of them are kind of portrayed as being very mindful of their own fragility and worry about their last death, because they've already died once. They don't necessarily want to go through that again. But there is like increasingly it being presented to them as actually, the fact that you'll wear apart and wear down as undead isn't much different than how it was in life. Like, you would have grown old, you would have got worn out and run down. physically through the process of aging. And Belinda from the Desolate Council kind of presents it as it's kind of what binds us to being alive, that we will wear ourselves out eventually, like we would have when we had a pulse.
Yeah. Obviously, further below, I think I wrote something on Forsakens do have the potential of living forever. Guaranteed they managed to keep themselves together all throughout it, though.
Yeah.
So there is that if you want a immortal race, since Night Elves aren't immortal anymore.
Yeah, just get yourself killed, resurrected,
Yeah.
and you're done. Then you will live forever once you've died.
Let's talk a bit about, I guess, because you have that sort of faith side to your undead, right?
So Corvinus is a reverend. He's a priest of the Holy Light. So yes, he's a religious person.
Yes. It's an interesting thing with the Holy Light. Some Forsaken still using it, even though it causes them physical pain due to their soul being sort of just not all there, from what I understand, right?
Yeah, there's kind of an ambiguity over it. Some people think that it shouldn't be possible at all, but I think it's more to do with your physical nature. Like, you are animated by dark magics, and you're sort of sustained by them. Like, you're continually animated and kept going by those kind of powers. And I think that's why being able to wield the light can be very difficult. That's why there aren't very many priests who are undead who can wield the light. You don't really come across many undead paladins, though a few people do roleplay as undead paladins. But there is that kind of physical pain at using it, that disconnect that you kind of really have to work more to try and hear it and use it.
I imagine that could actually be a key part of their faith. The pain that comes with using this
Like a tone.
pure power is a reminder of your own impurity, and that you must sustain it, you must power through it in order to demonstrate your worthiness to wield the light itself.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting way to roleplay about things. Obviously,
go
ahead, it's fine.
No, I was going to say, for some, like you're saying, it's like an atonement. Like you accept it as like a penance. Like, this is a price that you are paying to kind of make up for your life as part of the scourge.
I think it's also worth mentioning for anyone who's possibly confused. We've seen the Forsaken using the light with the priest order hall guy. It's just canon now. Alanzus Farrell, he's the guy. It's just canon now. So if they can do it, you certainly can as well.
There's also undead paladins, so if they can do it, you can as well.
And if a vast amount of the Scarlet Crusade can be brought back as undead and still use the light, then it's not as taboo as it used to be.
And it is an interesting thing to roleplay if you ever want to do it. Obviously, there's more of a stronger factor with specifically the Forsaken associated, undead with the Cult of the Forgotten Shadows, where they use the more twisted side, I guess, of the light shadow.
Yeah, it's I guess the antithesis of the Church of Holy Light is the Church of the Forgotten Shadow.
Yeah.
And it has its own 3 virtues that emphasize more about kind of power, and it's something that many Forsaken role players place stock in for their characters, because it's part of Forsaken society in the same way that the Church would have been part of everyday life as a living Lordaeonian. For many Forsaken, the Church of Forgotten Shadow is that kind of societal mechanism, institution, reborn, but with a slightly darker agenda.
Yeah. What are the 3 virtues, if you don't mind telling us?
God, I cannot remember for the life of me. I know one of them is power. So I think if instead of compassion, one of them is power. I think tenacity is still there, but like it's reframed as not tenacity for a just cause and achieving. It's like do what you must do to kind of achieve your ends, kind of thing.
Respect, tenacity, and power. I just googled it quickly.
I only had a tab open.
I have two screens, thankfully.
Respect tenacity and compassion. So compassion is swapped out.
Yeah. Obviously, instead of using the light, these ones use the shadow to mend.
Mhm.
So Stitch or whatever to heal the Forsaken, which doesn't hurt, obviously, and works more effectively. But unless you're a sucker for pain, of course, use the Holy Light.
And the holy light can heal the undead, extraordinarily painful, but it's
Yeah.
kind of now canon that the light could be used to mend undead flesh.
With naming conventions, normally they have their human names, or if you're role-playing an elven one, they have their elven names kept, but some
Mhm.
Forsaken I've noticed change their last names to, like, obviously in the Founder's Blightcaller. Let's say, for example, random names, Rotface, Ragegut, something like that. Something that kind of throws away their past life, or maybe they don't remember their past life, so they take on these other names.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because there are some characters who keep first name, last name from life. I think that's not as common. I think originally with the Forsaken, you kind of got to understand, they kind of wake up in the fields of Lordaeron, shambling around, wandering around, have no concept of kind of who or what they are or where they are. They've just been freed from the Lich King's grasp. And then slowly they kind of come together and Sylvanas kind of rounds them up. And, Sylvanas, the circumstances of her death made her a very scornful and very kind of hate-filled individual, directing that, initially towards the Lich King. And there was a lot of kind of rejection of your former life. So for a lot of Forsaken, there is a culture that was perpetrated that, you abandon your former life. It doesn't mean anything to you anymore. So you see a lot of characters giving up family names and taking up new kind of darker, more sinister names. There are some who simply don't remember, and they take a name as something to be known by. But there is kind of a culture of giving up that part of yourself because this is a new life. And Sylvanas's rhetoric is often that your past life has nothing to do with who you are now, because that life isn't going to accept you as you are. Only we will accept you as you are, kind of thing.
Yeah. The Forsaken initially joined the Horde through the Tauren, right, from what I remember.
Yeah, lovely, lovely Tauren.
The Tauren kind of saw pity on them, right? And I think they still actively to this day try and search for a cure for undeath.
Yeah, it's kind of cute, actually. I mean, I love Tauren anyway. So like having an undead who's actively like, I don't know, pro Tauren. I don't know if you could be anti Tauren, but Corvinus loves them. But yeah, it's the Forsaken kind of very much owe survival to the Tauren because they championed their membership of the Horde. And I think the Tauren saw in them, it kind of says in Chronicle that, I always pronounce his name wrong, Runetoten? Hanrun?
Hamul Runetotem, I
That's
believe.
the one. He kind of saw in them not necessarily like physical redemption, like there was people looking to kind of cure undeath, but he saw in them more spiritual redemption, like as a people. And it's interesting because Sylvanas sent emissaries to the Alliance and she sent emissaries to the Horde because at that point she had, the remains of the Scourge in the Plague Lands on one border. She had the Scarlet Crusade active within her own border. At this point, the Forsaken Dominion was pretty much Silverpine, but really just concentrated in Tirisfal and especially the ruins of Lordaeron. So her back was kind of up against a wall. She needed allies. The emissaries to the Alliance never returned. And so that kind of sent a very clear signal of, they're not going to want to have us. And she got lucky that, her emissaries to the Horde found the Tauren and they took kind of pity on them and saw in them a chance to kind of redeem as a people.
Yeah.
B9 asks a good question.
Yeah, I was about to say good follow-up question, and honestly, probably one I can answer as well. But how do the Forsaken fit into the ranks of the Horde? The very core fundamental value of the faction seems to be honor, and the Forsaken are always cast as utilitarians, like using plagues and gas.
An alliance of convenience.
I think
It's really that simple. At least it was at the start. I don't think they're During a Legion, that sort of period of time, I don't really think that there's much to justify the continued inclusion of the Forsaken in the Horde when there's peace with the Alliance.
Here's the thing. I think the honor aspect is more with the orcs.
Well, it's just the Horde in general
No,
shared a common culture before
yeah,
the
but
Forsaken were brought along.
that's what here's what I'm going to say. That the Horde themselves is more a band of misfits. They necessarily won't always clash hand in hand with ideals and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, they have no one else to turn to, and for the Forsaken specifically, that rings true because their families won't accept them, or they.
Yeah, that's it's a really good question to ask. It is initially very much like a lines of convenience. For the early Horde, it offered them a standing in the Eastern Kingdoms, especially kind of in Lordaeron. So it offered them strategic value. This was before the Blood Elves even joined. So it offered them a place to fight from if war started with the Alliance. That's kind of mentioned in Chronicles. And for the Forsaken, it is very much like we need allies. And at this point, the Alliance envoys never returned, and we've burnt our bridges there, and they'll never take us back or accept us. So the Horde is very much like, okay, we'll do. But I think pretty much it's been a very tricky position for the Forsaken because of things like the Wrathgate and the continued rumors that lingered of who actually ordered the development of the Plague. Sylvanas had spun it that it was Putris and Verimathras, whereas actually Sylvanas had ordered production. We know as kind of Forsaken players leveling. So it's very much an alliance of convenient. How do I say that word? Thank you. I don't know why I struggled there.
Don't worry, I struggle with words too.
I had like a small stroke, but I'm okay. And only after, we're talking about a decade here of their membership do kind of individual Forsaken begin to identify with this kind of cultural group and being like, actually, it's been a decade. They've helped us out. They've made us welcome. They've survived. Sorry, Ron?
They've put their backbone into the Horde, basically.
Yeah, basically, like Sylvanas kind of always something Corvinus always says. Sylvanas, says fear the living, or told us to. The Alliance gave us reason to fear them because they killed us and they always put pressure on our lands and the Scarlet Crusade and all of this. But the Horde kind of showed the Forsaken that they didn't have to be afraid of the living. And I think slowly that meant that Forsaken would feel more whole and kind of as part of that identity. Enough so that when push came to shove, plenty were willing to not stand with Sylvanas. And even though a great many did initially, more and more started to kind of hold credence and faith with the Horde as an entity.
Saying that the Forsaken aren't the only alliance of convenience at the moment as well. No big spoilers, but with the shadows rising, you'll kind of notice that the Zandalari are also in an alliance of convenience for the time being as well. The relations aren't that heavily, they're not on the good side, but it's a must,
Yeah, you could argue the same for the Kaldarai. Like it's they were never a strong or integral part of the alliance.
Yeah.
And then
that's very prevalent in their RP as well.
Yeah, and when push came to shove, they weren't necessarily there when they needed them. So, it's an alliance that isn't even really that convenient.
I think we kind of answering a quick question. I think we kind of became aware of the usage of the blight and all that stuff as soon as they started using it in big areas like Gilneas, for example.
Before then, like Wrathgate, in Wrath of the Lich King, it was
yeah. It's all just kind of the Forsaken weren't very good at hiding it once they put it to use,
So what's that green stuff in the canals under your city? Because it's water.
God, it's just Monster energy drink.
It's monster juice. It's Powerade.
We've gone down the questions a bit. I'll ask this one before we move on to biology and maybe biology a bit and maybe law.
Cool.
where can people find Forsaken Roleplay if they're looking to give a go at it?
So there are kind of a few guilds in the community that kind of align themselves along, I guess you'd almost say like party lines in a way. So you've got groups like the Rock Guard and the Grimgeist who are currently role playing, being of a more like loyalist thread. So they're still kind of following Sylvanas. Then you've got groups like the Hand of Agony who are still kind of like your more darker shade of Forsaken, but are loyal to the Horde. You've got groups like the Hallowed Host, who are generally undead folks who are kind of loyal to the Horde, and then you've got like the Tirus Fallen, who are like, you know, knitting and picking flowers and holding bake sales. That kind of covers everything, I think. So you've got most of them are based in Orgrimmar if they're not traveling around. I think the Rock Guard and Grimgeist kind of have their own like campaigns and stuff going on. So I think they travel a lot, and for obvious reasons can't be in character as loyalists in Orgrimmar. So you have a lot of kind of Forsaken role players in Orgrimmar because many of them are refugees still within the city. And then the Tirus Fallen are based in the Sepulchre in Silverpine, and the Hand of Agony kind of return there with us while they go off and kind of do their own kind of missions and stories and events. So Orgrimmar is a good place to find them. On the road, if you're looking for loyalist stuff, and if you're looking for sort of like, I don't know, like wellness Forsaken roleplay, then it would be the Sepulchre, like civilian stuff.
All right.
When it comes to non-guild RP, are there any areas that Forsaken could find other Forsaken to roleplay with?
It would.
It's to my understanding that non-guild RP in the Horde is less prevalent than it is in the Alliance.
Yeah, we don't. Even though we've got Orgrimmar, like my 13 years on Alliance, like I know how easy it is. Kind of, you could go to Feralus or Astronar, you could find like Night Elf and Worgen roleplay really easy, or duck into the hinterlands and find Dwarf roleplay really easy. That's less of a case in Horde because the numbers are lower and kind of a lot of people have to go up into guilds to get their roleplay. So really, Orgrimmar is the best place for like randomly bumping into people and kind of letting stuff happen. Otherwise, the only kind of anchored kind of undead community outside of that is at the Sepulchre, with the Tirus Fallen and the Hand of Agony and kind of the people who come and go. There's also the night markets, like you get a kind of lot of undead pop in to kind of buy stuff and what have you. But ungilded random stuff, it's either going to be the Sepulchre or Orgrimmar.
All right. You were going to say something, Markus?
Yes, that being Forsaken or just undead in general, are they damned to hell because they are undead? And by the hell, I guess we mean the maw now.
Yeah. Gosh.
I don't think we've had anything on that, to be honest.
Yeah.
I am under the impression that undead, all of them, their afterlife is the maw, and it has been. I can't remember why I have that impression. I know we know that with Sylvanas at least.
I'm under the impression that what they do with their on death, as they did in on life, kind of plays into the fact. Obviously, this is saying if the maw wasn't a big threat at the moment, playing to the fact of which covenant they'd still go to anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a big question mark. Obviously, Arthur's famous last words, "I see only darkness before me." Like we have a rough idea of, where he may have been heading. Sylvanas as well saw only darkness, so there may be something that if you are undead and then die, perhaps that is where you go. Obviously, many of the Forsaken they were all alive at one point. So they would have gone off to kind of various other places and then be kind of ripped from there and placed back into their bodies, I'm guessing. But it's not very well fleshed out at the moment.
There's spoilers in chat, but I mean, obviously you're going to see it on the screen anyway, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you're not completely damned if you're Forsaken, because apparently KT is in Maldraxxus, and apparently there's a few other Forsakens in Bastion and so on.
Okay.
It's fine, guys. As long as there's no big story spoilers, it's fine. I just don't want to spoil it for anyone who doesn't want to be spoiled, I guess that
And,
answers the damn part.
I think that makes sense. I also think that they're going to reverse the idea that being undead means you go to hell, which now is the more with their new Shadowlands Covenant system. I think that
Yeah.
Forsaken will go there like anything else. So for anyone role playing undead, if your character had peered behind the veil somehow and foreseen their miserable fate, perhaps it will look less miserable for them now, or it was never that bad to begin with.
Yep. I mean, we've covered a bit on the biology, but I guess here's some interesting facts. Apparently, some Forsaken bleed a green ichor, which I
Ichor, yeah.
presume it's from a substance from them being risen. But obviously, some undead just don't have any blood or liquid running through their body at all. We spoke a bit about this, but some Forsaken may lose consciousness given enough time, which they develop rot brain, but there are elements in way of keeping you preserved, which some Forsaken I presume know how to, which makes them be able to live forever.
Well, that's why, because the Apothecary Society initially wasn't concerned with weapons of mass destruction. It was concerned with Forsaken preservation, because the bodies are so fragile. The Apothecary Society was, if you think about a traditional apothecary, it's like a chemist, was solely concerned with preserving their bodies and, finding the right creams and tinctures and suppositories and whatever, just try and keep them going.
Yeah, there's also the Forsaken that they're missing their jaws, how we all think they just gurgle. They actually talk through magical means, you'll be able to hear them perfectly fine, in other words.
Some find those means, there's a couple of characters, and I don't know the circumstances of their deaths well, but I think one of them had died by having their throat slit, and so when they try and talk, it's kind of very distorted because of how deep the wound was. And I think that's really quite interesting as something to role play, because the manner of your death will affect, your condition as an undead, and also potentially your ability to communicate.
Yeah. Apparently, most food tastes like ashes to Forsaken. They don't need to feed, but some, I guess, have a habit from their life that they just kind of eat.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of variance. I know with the DKs, the Death Knights, it was stated that a lot of food kind of tastes like ash, and that's kind of a lot of Forsaken kind of take on that stance as well. Corvinus doesn't eat because he doesn't need to. His argument is, whatever goes in isn't coming out of its own free will, so there's no point in just cramming things inside my body. Although role players having a fully functioning digestive system, and they'll have a 3-course meal and go with it. So it depends a lot on how you want your undead to be, really.
Yeah.
What about Alliance aligned Forsaken? Do we tend to see any of those people who just want to go back to their human families? It was shown in Before the Storms that living humans were ready to accept them once again.
Yeah, I mean, I would even
at least.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it depends a lot on how much stock, I suppose, they hold as being Forsaken themselves. Forsaken is kind of less of a race and more of an ideology. Alonzus Fowl is undead. He does not identify as Forsaken. And he states that kind of very clearly in Before the Storm, that, he visits the Undercity and is kind of, Nathanos, bows to kind of him and, acknowledges his greatness as an individual. But Alonzus is very clear that I'm not Forsaken. I'm an undead, but I'm not part of, your group. And so I think there are Forsaken who don't there are undead who don't identify as Forsaken, and for them there are maybe more options because they're not bound by the Horde Alliance division. They're not necessarily beholden to kind of stay within their lands. So you see some undead in the Argent Dawn and the Argent Crusade And I would imagine for them, there are maybe more means to reconnect with their former lives via friends and family.
There's Argent, Kirin Tor,
Yeah.
all those other factions that you can kind of see undead in as well.
Yeah. But then there's the flip side of how many families would realistically, accept someone like that. And, many Forsaken and undead are aware of that. And, for many, it's not even worth trying,
Yeah. Kind of got lost of track because of that. Let's go on to lore, I guess. We're okay. We all know. I can skim through some of these, I guess, because we're kind of 15 minutes away from roughly being the end. I'm sure we're all aware with the whole Lich King's sort of story and how the Forsaken came to be with Sylvanas as well, and how they joined the Horde, which we technically covered prior.
Mhm.
There was, of course, the previous Scarlet Crusade threat in Tirisfal, which apparently the Argent helped the Forsaken deal with permanently.
Yeah, I
So-
think in Cataclysm, Voss kind of ties up the loose ends there and kills the leadership and what have you.
So where is the Scarlet Crusade now then?
I mean, Scarlet Crusade roleplay has been asking that question for years.
Roleplay now that used to be a part of the Scarlet Crusade, and he's going around the Plaguelands searching for remnants of the Scarlet Crusade, not to bind it back together, but to kill everything that was left behind, to destroy it all.
I think that's just
But
it, really. Remnants.
Yeah, right now they're wandering around handing out leaflets.
Because
okay.
Whitemane's now one of the four horsemen, so
Yeah.
yeah.
And she
Well,
was
she was
resurrected from a kind of Scarlet Monastery that was already in ruins, because at that point Voss had already kind of done a number on it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So and
go
by
ahead.
New Avalon, how was that place destroyed? Well, you see, if you go there now, you still see the Scarlet Crusade fortress.
Mhm.
Who controls it now?
I think that place was just demolished by Death Knights, wasn't it?
Well, there's the New Avalon part that's destroyed.
And then there's the other. Oh God, I can never remember the name. But then there's the cathedral and the keep and stuff. I want to say
Yeah.
Tears Hand.
Tears
Or something.
Hand, Tears Hand.
I think that was at some point under Scarlet control, and then the Scarlets were resurrected into undeath, and just kind of continued on business as usual, really. And then they were dealt with by the Brotherhood of the Light with the help of the Argent Crusade, then destroyed the last of them. So if you do the quest, you kind of kill off the undead Scarlet Crusade, and then it's replaced. All the NPCs are replaced by Argent Crusade ones and Brotherhood of the Light characters.
And Welly Ellie Boots mentions Whitemane also suggests some light bad stuff, if they remember correctly, saying that her madness has left her in undeath. And I'm just going to say now that I find that not you saying it, of course, but just the idea of it quite silly.
I think Scarlet's could be just another topic on its own, to be honest.
Really good, yeah.
I find Scarlet Crusade very interesting. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
You got Nathanos and Sylvanas. Nathanos being more of a die-hard loyalist to Sylvanas, but in love, I guess.
Yeah, or in lust.
In lust.
They refer to
Oops.
each other as love.
Speaking of undead.
All right, let me just hop back in. I forgot I was AFK. That's my undead pirate.
Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine.
Nice.
We spoke a bit about when the Blood Elves joined the Forsaken. Not the Forsaken, the Horde. The Forsaken helped them deal with the remaining Scourge in the Ghostlands. Sylvanas, after Lich King's defeat, firstly committed suicide.
Yeah, she throws herself from Icecrown onto the Saronite spikes below. She's had enough.
Yes, but then
On
she
that,
kind of got resurrected.
do you
But
think that the visions that she experienced that drove her to her actions today, arguably, were because of the fact she landed on Saronite, or that was just the fate that truly awaited her?
I because in the same way that Arthas was in many respects kind of irredeemable as a person, and I think a lot of what Sylvanas had done had been, not not good. In this second life of hers, I think what she saw as that darkness was her fate, and I think her path leading up to everything in Shadowlands, I think, started at that moment. I think the second that she saw that darkness and that darkness saw her, I think there was some relationship between the two, and I think everything from there started off at that moment.
I think everyone's perspective at this point is Sylvanas is just trying to break them all.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. And then I presume after that she'll probably just want to die peacefully.
She'll throw herself onto some more spikes.
Yep. And then the Valkyrie will be like, no, stop it.
Yeah, no, good girl, get yourself together.
Obviously.
I've got another.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is one for everyone. If you have an undead character, Forsaken specifically, well, not specifically, but ideally, does your undead character relate more with what they are now with the Forsaken, or the people that they once were?
And this is actually something in regards to Before the Storm as well. So
yeah, it's really interesting. So I think in Before the Storm, it's alluded that it was very heavily censured and cracked down any association with your past life. One of the members of the Desolate Council talks about having to hire heroes, and it's actually a quest you can do where you kind of sneak into his house or the ruins of his house and get some books and bring them back to him. And in the book, he explains that the Dread Guards would confiscate the books and chastise him and tell him off, and would destroy his personal possessions that he would recover from his past life. So for a long time, even though you had free will, you weren't free to do that. Like, that was a kind of a big no. And then with Sylvanas leading the Horde, she's not there to set the standard and enforce it. She doesn't really leave any mechanism behind. So the Desolate Council steps up and organizes the day-to-day running of the city that you would need. And a lot of them are just people. Like, they're not Dread Guards, they're not apothecaries, they're not Dark Rangers. They're just the men and women of Lordaeron who died and were resurrected. And here they are, and they're undead, and they just kind of got to get on with things. And for them, increasingly, there is an acceptance of we're undead and we're forsaken, and that's okay, and that's fine. And there's a lot of value in this life if we can find it. But their lives aren't necessarily worth living. Surviving isn't living. Like, surviving day to day isn't a life. And I think there's kind of an undercurrent of, well, what's the point of all of this? Like, who are we? And what are we about as a people? And I think Sylvanas was so integral to that identity, and that without her, you see more Forsaken now reconnecting with their past lives and kind of embracing that aspect of who they were. Some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent, some not at all. Some just outright reject it, and that's fine. That's very much part of who they are.
It sounds as if Sylvanas, who many saw as like the beacon that held their people together, was in fact rather a train that stopped them from deciding who they were for themselves, which is, in my opinion, what she was.
Yeah, that's very much the view that Corvinus takes on the whole situation. It's very much like, Sylvanas did keep us safe. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like, we would not still be here if it wasn't for her, looking after us. But surviving isn't living. And, she wasn't, in his eyes, good for them as a people, because they needed more. They needed some reason to go on living. And so that kind of the cult of the Forsaken mentality, because, it's more of like an ideology, and how did the Church of the Forgotten Shadow fit into that ideology, and these all reinforced Sylvanas' ideals and her perspectives on things. And so you didn't necessarily always get to see that softer side to the undead, that more quote unquote human side to them, until recently. And that's something that Blizzard's been shining more of a light on a lot recently.
I think that's fine otherwise. Some of these other lore topics that I put up here actually can be covered in a topic that I think Marek is eager to do at some point, which is the story so far for like BFA, so I'll leave those out. Otherwise, unless there's any, okay, here's what we'll do actually. Throw up your questions in chat, if you have any. I'm gonna just do the round of promoting shit because I'm bad at selling myself. And Markus, I think I sent you some RP questions. You can pick one from there and throw it into the chat as well.
That's why you sent me those.
Yes, there should be one there
Yeah.
you can pick. If you haven't subscribed already, YouTube, there should be a link below. I'm 7 away from 100, so I've been trying to get people to fucking subscribe, but it seems not many are. But I want that custom URL. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. I've made a Patreon now. There's 2 tiers. One is basically a tip jar in a sense, but I mean, if you join the Discord, you get the supporter rank. The second tier is you get the supporter rank and you get a shitty doodle every month from me.
He says this shit, but they're really endearing.
No,
Should
they're
I?
really shit.
I think they're cute.
But I currently don't earn any income, so it does help if I have that support there. What else am I missing? Obviously,
Not sure I can answer that, Rain Watcher. I'm sorry.
obviously there is Ask FM. Although looking at Ask FM for the past 2 weeks or so, getting the spam of shout outs and stuff, I think I might throw that away. If you want to ask us questions, join the Discord, which I'll provide a link in the chat if you haven't already. Join it and ask any questions you want to ask there. Let me find the link. I don't want to keep making a new link, otherwise it makes the past ones irrelevant. There you go.
Week, folks, if you're ready, Fusion.
There's coffee, which again is linked below. There's Twitter, link below. So yeah, all that stuff. Go to it if you haven't already. Any support helps, and go ahead to throw that question up.
Your OC, what is their biggest flaw, and what do they believe their biggest flaw is? That is your question of the week. Also, I'd like to preemptively thank Oak. Me and Fuse wouldn't have had much a clue what to talk about without his very generous help. So thank you for popping by. You've saved us a great deal here.
I'm going to throw up the
you're
links in
welcome.
chat just quick, and then Markus can throw up the question. Right, Discord at the top there. Yeah, okay. Markus can throw up the question. I'll put the question up on Discord as well for those people inside it to kind of answer it if they wish. Small blue diamond. Small blue diamond. You forgot to remove the emote.
I thought I added a bit of character.
Let's have a look.
You'll see the question of the week in the Discord channel as well.
Yep, I put it up now. Were there any questions asked? Let me just scroll up a bit. Who is the worst character written at the moment, and why is it Kalia? To be honest, the worst
There's
character.
a lot of hate towards Kalia.
I think Sylvanas is worse than Kalia.
I feel very much like that guy who says like leave Brittany alone, except replace Brittany with Kalia. I know I'm kind of talking about her.
I don't think Kalia's had any room to do much yet.
Yeah, not much. She died. That's kind of people's biggest issue with her. Is she died in the way that she was brought back.
Oh shit! Sorry, I completely forgot to throw in the straw poll. Yeah, go ahead. You can keep talking. I'm just trying to find the.
Sure. What I will say about Kalia and what I like is that in Legion originally she was very much like it's just Kalia now. and she distanced herself from any notion of kind of going forward. And actually, it was on interacting with the undead even when she was still alive. Like, she was saved by Alonza's Fowl, who was undead at the time, and he kept her safe and mentored her. And then in the Fields of Arathi, it was speaking to her undead countrymen that kind of reminded her of her obligations. And so I think the circumstances of her resurrection raise eyebrows, and I think it's a sign of, you know, where the lore is going and what future stories are going to be told by Blizzard. But I like a lot that she seems to be taking the time to help people. Like, she helped Derek come to terms with his state, and at the end of the war campaign, she returns to Tirisfal and she's helping the undead Kaldorai come to terms with being undead. And I think with what we see of like undead civilian life in Before the Storm and a little bit in Shadows Rising, it's nice to see that side of them, that there is a compassionate figure there who is, you know, taking the time to be like, you know, hey, things are pretty crap. Let's kind of try and work through it, kind of thing. Because you don't really see that sympathetic side of them, which I think is nice to see. But it also doesn't distract or take away from the other ways to roleplay them. So I think it's just nice that there's more of a light being shed onto that, which is pretty cool for me.
Yeah, I think that's it otherwise. Again, Sylvana's probably the worst in character for me. To be honest, all the Windrunner sisters, I don't like any of them. Don't worry, Alpha Betty Regretti. Spotlight week should be next week, so the topic that's voted this week will happen on the first Thursday of September. Hopefully, I can get a guild, you know, to interview, but we'll see. I'm really falling back on that. I'm very poorly organized, as you can see. Our motto for this stream is consistent but crappy but consistent. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for joining, Oak. Check out the links below, and